So thank you very much for this opportunity. For those who don't know me, my name is Kati. I'm a rising fourth-year HST-MEM student, and I work with Jayashri Kapathy-Kramer at the Martino Center. In terms of research, I'm mostly interested in how we can use deep learning image analysis and how we can translate it into clinical work, mostly from the perspective of what is missing to make particularly MDs, because I'm one myself, or I was one in my previous life, trust a model's output, and what is currently missing in that transition. One of the aspects that I'm personally very interested in, although I'm actually not working on it directly, is bias. And to clarify in the context, bias means that a model is relying its predictions on factors that happen to be correlated with the outcome of interest in the training data due to a poor data set curation. But there is no causal or biological connection between these factors and the prediction outcome. And especially in healthcare, biased algorithms have dangerous and long-lasting implications on patient safety, particularly if they're deployed without much care. Okay, so to start with, we need to acknowledge that medicine is biased, humans are biased, and therefore most medical data sets are biased as well. Some, and I was actually one of them when I started my PhD, think that having an quote-unquote impartial algorithm making the decisions would actually help to mitigate bias or existing biases in medicine. It turns out that it's not that easy. And in this really nice opinion piece in the New York Times that I can just recommend to all of you to read, Dr. Kula is laying out why he thinks that the use of AI in healthcare could even worsen existing disparities in healthcare. He particularly writes about 3 reasons to believe that. 2 of them are really of importance for the talk here. And for the task at hand, that means the automatic assessment of brain health metrics. So if a group is not represented in training data, the resulting algorithm won't be reliable for members of this group. And in our case, if the data set is weird, that means if it consists of subjects that are white, privileged, or educated from industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, that term is actually borrowed from the psychology research, it might be bound to fail on individuals who don't belong to this highly privileged group. Another point that's also related to data and data collection is that algorithms that are deployed in real-world scenarios need to get trained on real-world data. And that also means that they are at risk to incorporate and also perpetuate economic and social biases that lead to health disparities. This is because networks learn associations between input and data and the associated ground truth. And let's assume that we have a data set in which more patients who belong to underrepresented minorities suffer from poor brain health, just by accident. A network trained on this data might then learn to associate the affiliation with an underrepresented minority with poor brain health, and then automatically assign everyone who belongs to these groups with a poor brain health metric, irrespective of other features that might prove otherwise. So that's the definition of bias in machine learning. And Dr. Kula's conclusion in the article is that the risk with AI is that these biases become automated and invisible, that we begin to accept the wisdom of machines over the wisdom of our own clinical and moral intuition. And that hints towards another quote-unquote bias, kind of like a downstream bias, or maybe even danger in the deployment of AI algorithms in the clinic, meaning that users would rather trust the output of an algorithm than their own intuition that they might have developed over years of training. So to show you that the risk of bias is not just something abstract that some scientists worry about, I brought you an example of a bias algorithm that got deployed in a real-world scenario. So Winterlight Labs, that's a Toronto-based startup, they develop auditory tests for neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis. Their software registers the way you speak, so it uses speaking samples, analyzes this data, and then tells you whether you might have a neurological disease or not. The problem with this particular algorithm was that the developers used a training data set that only contained speech samples from native English speakers, and actually all of them came from a really small region in Ontario. So the patient population that the algorithm got ultimately applied to, however, contained a much broader variety of speaking patterns than the training data set. And that actually resulted in a trial run in a lot of erroneous classifications of patients with unfamiliar speaking patterns as having a neurological disease while they were actually perfectly healthy. And I think this example illustrates that you need to have the target population in mind and while you're developing and designing your algorithm, and to make sure that the training data is covering it. Questions like how can data be biased? What are the ways? The most prominent one is demographics. That contains gender, age, race, among many others. The second one is patient attributes. So their size, their body mass index, whether they're left or right-handed. Then we have so-called acquisition bias, particularly in MRI. Means that some sites might, particularly the ones who serve patients with a lower socioeconomic backgrounds, might not have access to like fancy machines. So their machines and acquisition protocols might be different from the ones that we use at MGH. And such that the algorithm could, in theory, learn to associate particular acquisition protocols with an outcome. Another one is disease representation or disease presentation, meaning that a disease can only be labeled and learned as a disease once it has been diagnosed. So early and more subtle disease representations might not be labeled as such because they couldn't be diagnosed properly. And then the last one is label bias, meaning MDs, like everyone who's like labeling this data is not perfect and also subject to their own personal biases, and that translates then into the training data. I'll mostly focus on the first 2 points for the remainder of my talk. And so for now, let's consider an example. It's an imaginary example. We want to predict the favorite color of a person from their MR scan. And for the sake of the example, we only consider 3 colors, green, yellow, and pink. And the network is trained on a data set with the label distribution that you can see here on the slide. And it can, at least like with respect to like the labels, it can be considered fairly balanced. So the model is trained and internally validated. It looks really good. And then it's applied to an external data set that consists of 90 patients, 30 of each with like kind of like the favorite color green, 30 with the favorite color yellow, 30 with the favorite color pink. So even that is like kind of like reflecting the color distribution of the training data. And it does get all the greens and the yellows right, but it performs terribly on the pink, like the people who have pink as a favorite color. What's necessary to know about this data set that it only consists of men. And then I don't have the data here, but it works fairly well, almost perfectly on a female data set with the same favorite color distribution. The question is why, and one possible explanation is that it might have something to do with the gender, because it works perfectly on the female population, but not on the male population. So if we look at the gender distribution of the data set, for simplicity, we assume that there is, like, they're binary gender, so we have men and women. It looks perfect with like 50% male and 50% female subjects. But if we look at the label distribution within the gender, or among the genders, we can see that while all colors are represented in the female data set, pink is a little overrepresented here. There was no male subject in the training data set with pink as a favorite color, which could lead us to the assumption that the network has learned to associate the color pink only with a, well, quote-unquote female brain, but not with a male brain. The question is, on MRI, don't just like all brains look the same, or is there a reason to worry about bias, at least from a biological structural point of view? The short answer is not all brains look the same. And particularly for male versus female brains, there are reported group differences. I think the most prominent one, or well-known one, is the volume. But we've all listened to the brain map talk. While on average or on a group level, we can say that female brains might be a little bit smaller than male brains or might be described to be different. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's possible to pick out whether an individual brain is female or male. But apparently there's subtle structural differences, and it might not be big enough for a human to pick them up on an individual level. But they are big enough to be picked up by a neural network, as this paper has shown. And in this figure, they highlight the structures that are the most salient for the differentiation between male and female brains. And that has the potential to introduce bias in an algorithm. Another potential source for bias are differences in brain morphologies between ethnicities. And so papers like this one have shown that on average, again, brains from an Indian study population are significantly different from the typical MNI brain atlas, which has been developed using only Caucasian individuals. The same has been shown for populations from Korea and also Japan, and not just in children. Many more in the literature, mostly Asian populations. Again, that there is a difference on average doesn't mean that there is a difference on an individual level for sure, but as in the example on the previous slide, a network might be able to pick up subtle differences, and this could introduce bias. So even for me, I'm a white, fairly privileged woman, there is a reasonable chance that a newly developed algorithm for brain health assessment would not apply to me because I'm a lefty, and most neuroscience studies exclude lefties. I think as far as I know, roughly 90%. On a more positive note, there are ways to mitigate bias. Going through this slide in detail would be out of the scope of this talk, but it's important to note that these strategies involve all steps in the development of machine learning algorithms, from pre-processing over training to post-processing. The goal of these strategies is to achieve a model that has a high accuracy, which is our goal for all of these models, while ensuring that it doesn't rely on sensitive or protected attributes like the social economic background or race. And so if these strategies are successful, the output of the classifier does not correlate with protected or sensitive attributes. And that in turn makes the algorithm development process a multi-objective optimization problem. The more accurate, the better, and the less predictions are based on sensitive attributes, the better as well. Important is that we need to be aware and define what are the sensitive attributes that the model should not rely its decision on, which in turn means that we need to be aware of potential biases before we even start. And that might hint towards a deeper problem within the whole field, is that oftentimes it is discovered that a particular algorithm is biased once it has already been rolled out. And that, like the kind of like dropping the bomb of like this algorithm is biased is most often done by individuals who are kind of like negatively impacted by the outcome of or by the prediction of an algorithm. And I think biases should not come as a surprise. The design is super important, and I really hope that the field is diversifying a little bit, and that might also mean that kind of like the awareness of potential biases might rise as well. And another suggestion on how to deal with bias in models are so-called model cards. And here you can see how one of it can look like. It's a little dense on this slide. You don't need to like read through it, but this is kind of like an example of how it would look like. These model cards are short documents that would ideally accompany a trained model. And in these cards, researchers would provide benchmarked evaluation in a variety of conditions, for example, across different cultural, demographic, or phenotypic groups, and also intersectional groups, for example, a combination of age and race or sex and ethnicity. Additionally, they would disclose the context in which models are intended to be used, and then also give like important guidance to the end user, and also provide details of the performance evaluation procedures and other relevant information. I want to close with this quote from the New York Times opinion piece that I've opened the talk with. And Dr. Kula says that, but most fundamentally, thinking about bias means recognizing that humans and not machines are still responsible for caring for patients. It is our duty to ensure that we are using AI as another tool at our disposal, not the other way around. With that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if we still have time, I'm happy to answer questions.